Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for your time and interest in this panel session, Transforming the Grid with Transactive Energy. Many thanks to Professor Venkatesh and the Ryerson team for putting today's conference together. And a special thanks to Opus One Solutions, who are sponsoring this session, and Ben Allman from Opus One has joined us and will be presenting some material as well. I'm Ali Golriz. I'll be moderating. Just to give everyone a sense of where we are going in this hour, I'm just first going to introduce our distinguished panel members. Then I'll be spending a few minutes just setting up the conversation with a definition of transactive energy and some quick thoughts on distribution system operators and their role in a TE future or transactive energy future. Following that, each of our panelists will be providing an approximately 10-minute presentation, leaving us hopefully with 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So we won't be taking questions until the Q&A part of the hour, but please feel free to capture your questions in the designated area in the Hopping platform as we go along, and I'll be monitoring that and posing questions to the panelists. I'm hearing a little bit of background noise. If folks could, yes, thank you. So just in terms of introductions, and this is in the order that we will be presenting today. First up will be Tanguy Hubert, who is a senior technical leader, DR integration at EPRI, where he develops, manages, and executes projects researching the large-scale integration of DER in collaboration with partners across the industry. Tanguy received his bachelor's from Supelec and his master's and PhD degrees in electrical and computer engineering from Georgia Tech. As part of his PhD research, Tanguy developed optimization models for residential energy management and electricity pricing design. He additionally holds a master's degree in public policy from Georgia Tech with a focus on energy and environmental policy. Elli Ntakou is an advisor at the consulting firm Quanta Technology, where she assists with clients with planning, implementation, and policy aspects of projects related to power markets, grid modernization, and DER. Elli received both PhD and master's degrees in systems engineering from Boston University and a bachelor's degree from National Technical University of Athens. Her doctoral thesis proposed the formulation for a distribution-level power market that optimizes the use of DER. And as part of her graduate research, Elli co-authored a white paper on competitive provision of DER services, which was published as part of the New York REV proceedings. Ben Allman is product manager for transactive energy at Opus One Solutions, where he brings wholesale market concepts to the distribution system and works with utility partners to develop and deploy transactive energy markets throughout North America and Europe. Prior to joining Opus One, Ben was a managing consultant at Navigant Economics, or Guidehouse now, where he focused on North American energy markets. Prior to that, Ben spent 4 years at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, as an economist investigating allegations of market manipulation. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees in economics from Boston University. He also has a master's degree in management from the UCLA Anderson School of Management. And lastly, I'm Ali Golriz, lead system and sector development in the innovation and R&D group at the ISO. I've worked at the ISO and the predecessor organization, the Ontario Power Authority, in a number of roles since 2009. But specifically, I spent many years on the design and implementation of resource procurements with a focus on DER and power purchase agreements. In terms of my educational background, I have an engineering degree from the University of Waterloo and an MBA from the Brockman School of Management, University of Toronto. I just have a couple of slides before handing things over to Tanguy to get us into the details. I wanted to provide a little bit of background here. First, to define transactive energy, or TE for short. My sense is that folks think about and define TE differently, but here on the slide, it reflects a definition from Gridwise Architecture Council, which says that TE involves systems that use economic and control mechanisms for meeting the needs of the entire system. And they note that, or Gridwise notes that the value, or economics, if you will, is the key parameter to operate TE systems around. Gridwise also mentions in their commentary that wholesale markets are TE systems, established TE systems. But the excitement, I think, in the space is at the distribution level, where TE systems and the wholesale, where TE systems are not being used today. As well, I think there's work that needs to be done with respect to the interface between the transmission and distribution system. The intent with TE, I think, is to extend price signals to the distribution system, as well as managing distribution constraints and looking to optimize the distribution system. And in the discussion today, we will be expanding on what this means, speaking to distribution services, such as non-wires, alternatives, and distribution, locational, marginal pricing, or DLMP, among a number of other things. But beyond that definition, I think when we talk about TE, most people envision the mass participation of distributed energy resources, or DER, in a scalable and robust manner. And to give more color to that, there are a number of architectures that are discussed, with perhaps the quote-unquote layered model, which I'm going to speak to in the next slide a little bit, being a key focus. And in that sort of layered approach to the architecture, one of the policy areas is the introduction of and structure of distribution system operators, including the governance framework that comes with that. Again, just economics is a central piece of the definition of TE, and a bit more broken down. I think that involves different services being defined, programs or markets being developed, and having granular, economically efficient prices for the provision of services and charges for the consumption of services. And this is very much the aspect of TE that the panel will be focusing on. The final thought here is with respect to the control piece of the TE definition, and control needing to be automated to facilitate mass DER participation. And that gets us into things such as communication protocols, interoperability, software systems for managing DER, smart contracts that execute algorithmically, and so on. And hopefully that gives us a okay shared understanding of TE. One more slide here, and I'm handing things over to Tanguy. I just wanted to touch on distribution transmission coordination frameworks and speak to distribution system operators in this context. So I'm just going to speak to the diagram here, which is adapted from work and ideas from Paul DeMartini, Lorenzo Christoph, and J.D. Taft, a couple of whom I've actually had the pleasure of working with. So the framework is a spectrum with two bookends and a variety of ways to slice and dice things in between. Starting on the left side, the total ISO model involves the ISO extending all of its visibility systems, markets, etc., down to the distribution system. The team that developed the framework also referred to this as the grand optimization, which I think is a fantastic name for it. There are significant challenges with this, including scalability. Will it be possible to deal with all the data and crunch the numbers for dispatch and prices every 5 minutes? There are also modeling and tool issues. And then there are jurisdictional challenges with the FERC and state dynamic in the US, for instance, and different, but in some ways similar issues here in Canada. On the right-hand side, there is the total DSO model, and this is characterized by DER having a singular interface, and that being with the DSO. So in this model, the DSO is in a sense relaying signals from the ISO and layering in distribution signals. One way to think about this is that the DSO is sort of a super aggregator, if you will, an aggregator of aggregators, or an aggregator with its own set of needs. But I think an even better way of describing it is that the DSO is an institutional aggregator, especially if the DSO is independent and transparent about how it operates and treats DER. And in between the two bookends, there's many ways of going about it, but generally the hybrid DSO models involve DER having two interfaces, one with ISO, one with the DSO. The version I focus on is called dual participation, in which basically the DER deals with the DSO for distribution services and with ISO for transmission services, and all parties must coordinate and make sure that they're aware of what's going on. The panel will be focusing on DSOs, and how they would define services, manage DER, and generate prices. And with that, Tanguy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Elli, for setting the stage here for us and for the rest of our discussion. We thought we would start the discussion here with the first segment, discussing a little bit more in detail the notion of or the concept of grid services, especially at the distribution level, but also covering what has been done for many years at the bulk system level. So let's jump right into it with this first slide here. We have represented on the left side the bulk power services that have been in place for many years, and you'll recognize many of the usual suspects. The existing services at the wholesale market level are all very well defined. They are well packaged. Obviously, there are variations from one area to the other in terms of the fine details, but the point is those services have been around for quite a long time, and we have many years of experience with them. So obviously, they have been historically delivered by very large generators, and so the challenge at end today is how can we enable a greater participation from distribution connected DRs to provide some of those essential reliability services at the wholesale market level. Many of you are aware, I'm sure, of the ongoing regulatory push in that direction, especially in the US with FERC Order 2222. The key question there is how can we adapt or maybe revisit the service definitions and the participation requirements to enable a greater participation of DRs in terms of those services at the wholesale market. One area that is currently getting a lot of attention from the industry is what are some of the potential cross-domain impacts when we have distribution connected DRs that are providing services at the wholesale market level, and what kind of coordination is required between the various actors, transmission, distribution, and aggregators to ensure that those any adversarial impacts are minimized. And then another key issue, I think, when it comes to enabling more DRs to provide wholesale market services, especially when it comes to behind the meter resources, is this concept of double counting that we want to avoid as much as possible. So a lot of ongoing discussions on that topic to enable behind the meter resources to participate while avoiding any double payments for the same service. Finally, to wrap up on this first slide here, some new services are also being considered at the wholesale market level, taking into consideration some specific capabilities that inverter-based resources may have. One example is fast frequency response. So again, I wanted to start with bulk power services, and maybe now transition with the next slide to distribution services, which are all new. They are not yet well defined, not yet well packaged, and we are still working on specific parameters that we can use to define them in a kind of like a universal manner, covering location, timing, or magnitude requirements. I think as an industry, we're also still working on understanding what are the resources that can provide those distribution services. What kind of payment mechanisms, bidding mechanisms do we need to develop? What are the pros and cons of various mechanisms? How do we maybe need to revisit our MNV requirements to track delivery and assess performance? How do we tie performance to compensation? What kind of mechanisms are out there when it comes to recognizing that as much as we want to outsource some of the services to third parties, we also need to make sure that their compensation is commensurate with their level of performance. And maybe one more here, opportunities for value stacking strategies, enabling providers to not only deliver distribution services, but also pursue wholesale market opportunities to improve the efficiency of their business plans to develop those, to deploy those projects, and also to ensure that we can minimize as much as possible the cost of delivering at the distribution level. So that's a little snapshot here of these new distribution services that are emerging, but are still very much being defined and packaged. If we move to the next slide, a couple of examples of some of those distribution services that are emerging and that are making the grid more transactive. Services focusing on providing distribution capacity, mostly to defer traditional upgrades such as large transformers, large substations, very long lines. Other services focusing on voltage support, maybe differing traditional voltage regulation equipment. And then also other opportunities related to reliability, to resiliency, where we are trying to leverage DRs to support maybe abnormal operating conditions, and even possibly support the islanding of pockets of the distribution grid. So the common delimiter between all those services is, at the very basic level, all those services involve managing some power exports, power imports from DERs to address specific distribution needs. And the needs obviously vary depending on whether we are addressing thermal constraints, voltage constraints, reliability needs, etc. I'll mention that distribution capacity certainly has received a particular attention, and this is because usually when we are able to source that kind of service from a third party, there is a pretty substantial amount in avoided cost when it comes to deferring traditional thermal upgrades. And so obviously this allows to essentially pay for those services provided by third parties. And maybe one final note here, especially for the audience that may be more familiar with the wholesale market services. There are two different approaches that are being explored at the distribution level. Some utilities are combining the power and energy requirements when they specify a distribution service opportunity. So that means essentially specifying a capacity, how much capacity do we need, and also duration, for how many hours do we need that, and that's kind of combined into the same set of requirements. Another different approach could be to pursue something similar to what is done at the wholesale market level and separate the power and energy requirements and kind of follow a two-stage process very similar to what is done today at the wholesale market level. If we move to the next slide, I wanted to maybe connect the dots between two concepts that many of you are familiar with, and it's not entirely clear sometimes how they connect. So non-wires alternatives is kind of like the project view, the solution that will be used to defer, mitigate, or eliminate specific traditional upgrades. And at the same time, we have this kind of like parallel concept of grid services, where we aim to manage the imports and exports of a specific DER to address a specific constraint. So really the connection between the two here is that any given non-wires alternatives project may need to provide one or multiple grid services, depending on the specifics of the distribution needs or the transmission needs at the location where the project is being developed. So I wanted to have this slide here to kind of connect the dots between those two concepts, because again, sometimes it's not entirely clear how they relate with each other. And maybe one final slide as I conclude my segment here. I wanted to touch briefly on the key barriers that the industry is addressing today when it comes to maybe making it possible to have greater DR participation, and again, have a more transactive grid moving forward. So the interconnection process remains very time-consuming, sometimes costly, especially when we are thinking of DRs that intend to export to the grid. When exports are involved, the process is more thorough, maybe more upgrades required, and so that makes it more costly. So that's one area where the industry is working to try to streamline this a little bit. Another aspect here, and some of the other panelists will speak to this more in detail, but distributed services are very much location and time specific. So you need to have the right resources at the right place at the right time for this approach to make sense. And also the industry is still very much learning still how reliable are those DR-based solutions compared to traditional options. Maybe two more aspects. We do need new control, communication, and coordination capabilities when the number of service providers is increasing significantly. And then finally, because I know I'm at time here, for beyond the meter resources specifically, there is kind of a trade-off between providing grid services and staying on the traditional retail tariffs. And so I think the industry is still very much in the process of understanding what is this trade-off, how do we address issues like double counting, and also what kind of business model eventually aggregators can build to encourage greater participation of small DERs, especially DERs located beyond the meter. So that's what I had here to get us started. And Ali, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks very much, Tanguy. And that was a fantastic summary of the state of the industry, and I particularly sort of appreciate the just trying to connect the distribution conversations to the wholesale market conversations. So thanks very much for that. Elli, would you like to take it over?
Thank you, Ali. Good afternoon, everyone. So today for this part of the panel, I'll sort of stick under the umbrella of non-marginal alternatives and introduce a new concept called locational marginal value, or LMV. I know this sounds a little close to the well-known LMP, locational marginal price, but this is a different concept, and hopefully during the course of this presentation, the differences and what the LMV truly is will become clear. So if we skip 2 slides, next slide, yep. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. It's just sort of a reminder that sort of detailed, granular, non-wires alternatives analysis and comparison to traditional solutions is mandated in several states in the United States. So next slide. I wanted to sort of position and introduce this new concept of the locational marginal value through a market's perspective. So what you'll see here is a rough schematic of how markets work today. There is basically competition only on the transmission side. On the distribution side, we have average prices. At best, we actually have time of use prices and net metering. So a consumer with co-located demand and generation pays and gets paid the same for each consumed and generated kWh. So at the end, their total bill is the net consumption times that flat price. And in the next slide, what is envisioned is, in the near future, hopefully, changes primarily on the distribution side. So competition will be introduced in the distribution side, and there will be formation and operation of markets that mirror the wholesale markets. So there will be a capacity market whose clearing is going to be based on this concept of the LMV. And there's going to be shorter run markets, energy markets, that result in the DLMPs that you'll hear more from Ben and Ali in later talks. So LMV is a planning stage concept, is a planning stage calculation, and it encapsulates capital costs. So it's supposed to drive optimal investment decisions. And much like Tanguy just spoke to, we do sort of talk about changes in the distribution side, but for a smooth operation and a near optimal operation of the grid, we need interactions, we need an interface between the T and D sides of the grid. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to start sort of diving deeper and deeper into the locational marginal value concept. I laid out here for completeness a list of all the revenue streams that are generated and can be realized by a distributed energy resource. And wanted to say that what you'll see in the next slides in the locational marginal value, it sort of speaks to the T&D grid costs. So going to the next slide, we're listing here what are the properties of the LMV. So it is a means of evaluating the impact of DER, the ability of a DERs and NWA to provide grid services. Tanguy laid out all of them. Here I'm listing some of them: thermal overloads, reliability improvement, and voltage control. And again, this is sort of a planning stage calculation. It is the proposition here is a highly granular proposition, highly granular calculation in the space and in the time domains. And we'll see exactly what that means in the next slides. And another novelty here of the concept is to be able to evaluate reactive power providing resources. So in short, we'll come up with a separate dollar per kW, dollar per kVAR value for every distribution node and every hour. Going to the next slide, to start explaining the temporal and locational element of the locational marginal value, here is a schematic, a simple schematic of a distribution feeder with an overloaded line halfway through. So the red DER that is upstream of the overload, any injection from it does not lower the flow on this overloaded element. So at all times, that location has 0 assigned value. On the other hand, downstream of the overload, the green color-coded DER, any injection from it does lower the flow on that overloaded line. So the DER at that location has potentially a non-zero value. We say potentially and not for sure, because as we'll see in the next slide, there is a temporal element. So reducing the flow during sort of the times where there is no overload, reducing it further does not alleviate any grid constraints. So it is not assigned a value, it is assigned a 0 value. Lowering the flow at other times that you'll see highlighted here in green where the overload actually occurs, that injection reduces or completely alleviates the overload, so it does get assigned a positive non-zero value. Moving on to the next slide, let's try to sort of roll the LMV concept basics up to a real-life example. Here is a substation transformer overload. The substation feeds 2 feeders that are color-coded here in green and blue. And we're trying to calculate the LMVs against a $2 million traditional solution of a transformer upgrade. Going to the next slide, we see the LMV results sort of in a heat map graph. We see how the LMVs are increasing as we move downstream due to the impact of losses, reaching their highest value at the top right red area where the LMVs are the highest. This is the electrically longest path, resistance-wise longest path, so has the most load as well. So overall, very high losses on this path, resulting in that high LMV. And what does this high LMV mean? It means that 1 kW of injection at that red area is more valuable than a 1 kW of injection in another area, because it reduces the demand and the associated losses that are much higher in this area. So it has a higher impact on the violation at hand, that substation overload. Moving on to the next slide, we're trying to sort of reinforce here with this graph the concept of this value, this locational marginal value, as a capacity related concept. So we rolled the substation cost of 2 million based on the maximum overload to a $1 per kVA value. We call that a cost of capacity, and that's that red line that you see here, sitting slightly north of $365 per kVA. And the blue line is a cumulative locational marginal value across all hours for every distribution node. The horizontal axis is distribution nodes. So what you'll see is that this cumulative payment, this cumulative value to the DERs, to the NWAs, is in the ballpark of the cost of capacity of the traditional solution. And for multiple nodes, it even exceeds it, as you'll see on the right. That means that for these specific nodes, the same amount of DER injection yields a larger reduction of our grid constraint, or in other ways, we can get the same grid constraint reduction with less amount of DER injection from those specific nodes. So hopefully the usefulness of the LMV has started to resonate with you. The big step forward that it requires is the time granularity, this abandonment of the concept of peak hour analysis for distribution circuits. The LMV can be used as is, as a sort of an engineering and economics founded way to pay DERs, or it can be used to create less granular tariffs. But most importantly, the LMV is sort of the stepping stone to guide how RFPs go out, and how the stakeholders can evaluate the responses to the RFP. So what types are infeasible versus what types are better. Same for locations, which locations are optimal and which are not. As an example, going back to our real-life substation overload case, here is a result of a portfolio optimization process where DERs are proposed or suggested in those 5 nodes that are highlighted with a star here. And the optimization process through the locational marginal value sort of determines the cost optimal solution. And that is to sort of max out the proposed distributed energy resources at this red area on the top right, and then complete that with a little bit more DERs in other locations that you'll see, sort of another fuel-fired PV and another storage resource, to reduce the overload at the substation as much as needed. And of course, some proposed locations will not get selected. You see a location with a star that did not get selected for a DER in the optimal solution. This optimal siting and capacity needed is based on a granular time analysis. So as you'll see on the right-hand side of this graph, we're also able to come up with the hourly capacity requirement of all the DERs in the optimal portfolio for each hour that we're performing the analysis over. Moving on to the next slide. Quanta Technology has developed a software tool called DER Valuation Tool, DERVT, that incorporates all of the aforementioned concepts and analysis together with an automated workflow, automated data transfers from and to other software, data maintenance, and visualization. Running out of time here, but I'm almost done. In my last slide, I wanted to summarize the concept of the locational marginal value, a planning stage evaluation of DERs acting as non-wires alternatives to relieve various grid constraints. So the main novelties of the concept include the high locational and temporal granularity and the ability to evaluate reactive power providing resources. So with that, I wanted to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions at the end of the session.
Thanks very much, Elli. And it's always interesting to me, at least, to see the sort of visualization of different prices across the distribution system in a more sort of dynamic distribution environment. So thanks very much for that. Ben, you're up.
Great. Thanks so much, Elli. So hi, I'm Ben Ullman. I'm the product manager for transactive energy at Opus One Solutions. Quick introduction to Opus One Solutions. We are a software engineering and solutions firm based out of Toronto, Ontario. We work with distribution utilities across the globe to help them plan for the impact of DER on their networks, and then in operational timeframes, essentially run markets to procure services from those resources, and then utilize those resources in day-ahead and intraday timeframes to essentially secure their grids at least cost. Moving on to the next slide. The concept that we're talking about today is of course, transactive energy. And the fundamentals of transactive energy as they work out in these live deployments and field deployments that Opus One is engaged in across the world tend to be DER services to aid utility and ISO operations. And what that really means is looking to the DER to the points that both Elli and Tanguy highlighted earlier. That is to say, providing some grid service, which tends to be real or reactive power, and then figuring out some way to compensate it, which is the regulatory question. So those DER services would tend to be energy service, if it's, for example, a PV that's reducing load in a network, or it might be some sort of a demand response or output from a battery or a generator to resolve a constraint downstream of, let's say, a substation. Once you understand the services that you can procure, you can start assigning prices to resources. And as both Tanguy and Elli hinted, location and time are crucial components to this. Location matters because different parts of the grids experience different sorts of constraints. Time matters because depending on time of day and location, you're going to see different prices emerge. And then finally, there's this notion across our deployments of technological coordination. And what we see is that the early projects very much focused on showing that transactive energy could exist. You could assign a location and time-specific price, and you could find some service from a DER to aid utility and ISO operations. And now the next steps are, what are the coordinations between the various actors to make these concepts that exist in pilot projects go live? And so go on to the next slide, DER adoption. The reason that we really are seeing a demand for this, of course, is falling prices for a lot of the DER in these networks. And so a lot of utilities are seeing increases in EV chargers, are seeing increases in PVs on their networks. And then also regulation and policy are seeing a lot of ESG changes, such that everyone from REITs who are being asked to evaluate their carbon intensity to countries and states writ large, they're asking various entities, including utilities, to achieve certain carbon goals, are all looking to various DER as one of the levers they can pull on, in addition to, for example, changing the generation mix at the bulk system to reduce carbon intensity in general. And so the impacts of this is that industry barriers will change. ISOs, utilities, and retailers need to enhance coordination. Barriers to entry probably have to be lowered. Maybe the traditional interconnection process that the utility has to change. Potentially, the process by which a DER gets access to market-based rates changes as well. But that also means that there's increasing complexity in markets, and that has to be simplified to increase customer adoption rates. And then the result of that is that you get some sort of probably market-driven DER siting, operation, and ownership, which creates new business models for distribution utilities, but then also likely necessitates new regulations to figure out what are the next places in which maybe monopolistic capabilities emerge, or there are adverse incentives if certain entities are allowed to maintain control over various different parts of the system. So if we go to our next slide, what we see is the projects for transactive energy have evolved over time. First generation projects, as previously noted, very much focused on showing that you could do some sort of distribution system centered transactive energy project. That is to say, take a bulk market price, take a bunch of DER, take a distribution utility network model. These are all data that exist. And exist, let's say, as business as usual processes, and then do something innovative, which is create a location time specific price signal at the DER. And so what Opus One has done in these first generation projects is work with utilities and regulators, or I should say energy market operators, to create transactive energy demonstrations that assign a time and location specific price to a DER's activity based on the utilities network model, some load and generation forecasts, and DER bids and offers. And so that's very much taking a lot of concepts from bulk systems and bringing them down to distribution. What we're seeing now is as these transactive energy projects have become more successful and their learnings are starting to become understood, there's now this next step of bridging a gap to business as usual, which is FERC 2222 saying, okay, DER exists. They should be given access to market-based rates if they're above some rating, some kilowatt size. And so that's very much placing the onus on the various ISOs in the US to come up with a way to incorporate those DER into their systems that's going to force the software vendors, Siemens, et cetera, to create ways for DER to interface with their systems. But it's also going to ask the distribution utilities to think about how they want to allow DER to exist if DER are going to be given access to market-based rates. The distribution utility likely won't be able to prevent the DER from participating in the market if it's already been interconnected and been approved some commercial rating, let's say. But going forward, there's going to be a question of how to incorporate more DER if more DER want those market-based rates. And so we've seen current projects is a focus on operating envelopes or hosting capacity, essentially posting daily limits for how much injection or withdrawal can be performed at any DER node, or maybe an aggregated node, such as a substation or some other like higher level transmission distribution interface. And then the other place that we see, let's say, evolution in the innovations projects is what's called flexibility coordination in the UK. And so the previous concepts of location time specific prices are now being taken into much larger field demonstrations where the utility is looking to DER to provide that non-wires alternative, evaluate various different services via contracts. Think of those as similar to like some sort of an options contract where the utility gets the right to request a service and the DER owner operator has the obligation to provide the service if requested. And the service requests come through, in our projects, use of the GridOS optimization engine, which performs a security constrained economic dispatch of DER to output the optimal real and reactive power quantity values at each of the DER, so that the utility can procure the constraint management service that it needs at least cost and operational timeframes. What we also do is perform a midterm auction as well as some long-term auction functions to allow the utility to procure DER services at least cost based on some sort of, let's say, a capacity plan or a week ahead forecast. And so through these projects, what we're saying is, first step, a day ahead and an intraday price signal could be created based on just, let's say, energy services. Next step, various different contracts for services can be created, and the data can be organized and output daily up to like intraday 5-minute. And then finally, we get to this long-term goal, which I think Elli and Tanguy and Ali have spoken around, which is some form of, let's say, regulated ISO-DSO coordination. Right now, DSOs are bidding into ISOs and doing so, let's say, to purchase load. Right now, 2222 is going to facilitate market-based rates to DER. And the next question is, what is it going to look like when these systems are fully coordinated as opposed to spoken about being coordinated? So on the next slide, this concept of coordinating these systems largely falls to what's called a distribution system operator. This is the entity that would coordinate services between the bulk system operator, the utility, and the various DER owner operators. Where this DSO entity sits is going to depend on jurisdiction. You're going to have some entities that require the ISO to own the DSO. Others are going to ask the utility to own the DSO. And yet others are going to ask the DSO to sit between the utility and the ISO as an independent entity that is essentially interfacing with the aggregators, the DER, and the retail customers. And what this all gets to is location and time specific prices. And so we can go on to the next slide. And what we do at Opus One is, as we operate these markets for these various timeframes, we ensure that price is a core operational parameter, and we do so in one of two ways. The first way that's on the current screen is what's called a distribution locational marginal price. This is a price that assigns a energy, marginal congestion, and then marginal losses and voltage residual to DER operations based on the utility's network model and based on the DER bids and offers, as well as potentially an energy price at the substation or the transmission distribution interface. This does require use of a utility network model. And the reason for that is that without the distribution utility network model, we don't have any way of assigning a value to congestion and losses in the system because we don't have the data that tell us where the assets downstream of a substation are being constrained. A core dependency of this algorithm is an economic dispatch based on that same network model. So in much the same way as ISOs create a locational marginal price based on a security constrained economic dispatch, followed by a pricing algorithm, we're extending that concept to distribution to show the time and location specific variation and valuation down to the DER node. Now let's go on to the next slide, or I think it might be 2 slides from here. LMP plus D. LMP plus D is another pricing algorithm in which, instead of necessarily focusing on that to the node valuation, you focus on the capacity value of DER. And that is to say, you take the bulk system price and say, okay, well, you are having some sort of an energy impact. So we're reducing the energy cost in the system, but there's also some capacity values, and those are the real ones that essentially determine whether or not the DER is profitable and worth siting in some location. And so those distribution system benefits and potentially the societal benefits, maybe there's an ESG type adder, some sort of a carbon price that's location specific. For example, Local Law 97 in New York is looking to essentially create an implicit price for carbon. Maybe that becomes part of LMP plus D. And so you have these various different ways of looking at prices. If we go on to the next slide, you have these various different ways of looking at valuation, various different ways of looking at coordination in the distribution system, and then a very big open question on what does that final type of coordination look like. It's fairly certain that some sort of location time specific price will be a part of whatever takes place, that some sort of coordination between utility and DER is going to exist, as well as some coordination between DER and bulk system. And the question is, what does it look like for all 3 of those entities to be coordinated at once? And with that, I close.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Ben. And it's interesting as someone who works at an ISO. I really appreciate Ben, the way that you guys think about some of these concepts. It looks very similar to how we approach things at the wholesale market. So thanks for that. So folks, recognizing that we only have about 15 minutes left here, I had a few slides as well, but I do want to get to some Q&A, so I'm gonna quickly run through this. So again, thanks everyone for your time and interest. I'm going to be speaking to a demonstration project that I'm engaged in with our team at the ISO. There's quite a lot going on in this demonstration. It involves non-wires, of course, but also we sometimes think of it as a local electricity market. It's very basic in some ways, but regardless of using auction processes to generate distribution level prices. So just very quickly about the demonstration. In general, a summary here. It's an $11 million project. It's funded from innovation dollars, both from the ISO and Natural Resources Canada. Electric Utilities, they are a progressive distributor here in Ontario. They're a delivery partner in the project and operationalizing it. When we got the project going early on, we put together a couple of white papers and we lifted some concepts from those white papers. Specifically, the independent total Dso model, as we refer to it, is what we're employing in the demonstration. The demonstration is very focused on market and system operations and less so on regulatory and planning issues. And we're sort of attempting to connect the dots between sort of a distribution utility program and wholesale market design constructs, very similar to what Ben was just speaking to. For the project, we also developed a web-based platform to administer the participant-facing aspects of it. And in the demonstration, we're generating both distribution level capacity and energy prices. And from an ISO perspective, we're very focused on the coordination between distribution and transmission. And so we have a number of thoughts around how that would work, and we're engaging in a study around this as well as part of the demonstration. But generally, we envision a future where that sort of coordination between distribution and transmission happens through market offers. So the market constructs being sort of the vehicle for coordination. To give you a sense of where we are in the demonstration, so we got going in 2018, and last year in particular, we spent a fair bit of time with external legal, putting together a rules document and a couple of forms of contract, one for directly participating DER and one for aggregations. We spent a fair bit of time engaging stakeholders in making sure that they understand the approach that we're taking, and in particular, electric utilities work directly with the customers to make sure that there's awareness there and they come into the demonstration. We, as I mentioned, developed a platform. I'm going to speak to that in a second. And then November last year, 2020, we ran what we're calling a local capacity auction. So this is a distribution level capacity auction. I'm going to speak to the results of that. And for the folks that cleared in that local capacity auction, the requirement is for them to then participate in local energy auctions. And we started those in May. And actually, this was a bit of a milestone for us. On Monday, we had our first activation in the demonstration area. So it was a hot day, and we called on our DER to help manage the demand in the demonstration area. We're going to be repeating the process one more time in terms of the capacity and energy auctions. And we're going to be adding a small enhancement to that. We're going to be introducing a local reserves mechanism or a distribution reserves mechanism to the demonstration. And towards the end of next year, we're going to be wrapping up with a modeling study, again, focused on the distribution, transmission, coordination, and some lessons learned reporting as well. So this is just a snapshot of our platform. It administers, again, the participant-facing part of the project, including the registration, running the local capacity auction, contributor management for aggregation. So if your aggregators want to change out particular DER that are part of the aggregation, it facilitates, the platform facilitates test activations. It shows the actual demand and forecasted demand in the demonstration area. It runs the local energy auctions, sends activation notices, does MMB and settlement. So all of the sort of administrative components of the project are just captured in the platform. I wanted to speak a little bit about the demonstration area as well. So we worked with our planners, ISO planners, to identify the area. We were seeking a good spot in the province to conduct a demonstration. So Southern York region, or more specifically, the municipalities of Richmond Hill, Vaughan, and Markham. It's a fast-growing area with lots of urbanization. There's quite a bit of load, as well as a fair bit of existing DER in the area. And most importantly, in grounding the project in reality, there are a couple of stations that are needed or expected in the area over the next decade. So with the demonstration, it's not a real non-wires need. There isn't a reliability requirement today, but we're sort of simulating it and pretending that we're in the 2030 timeframe, and that the stations that are expected were not built, and we have to instead manage peak demand, the local peak demand, the distribution demand, using DER. Also noteworthy is that we focused on stations or big infrastructure right at the interface between the transmission and distribution systems. And my thought around this is that as distribution services emerge and TE, transactive energy, becomes real, it probably makes sense to focus on the low-hanging fruit, the big ticket items and assets. And as we get more sophisticated, it makes more and more sense to start looking at smaller, more granular opportunities. Just have a couple of slides left here. A key aspect in the project is just managing non-wires with auctions. So we have capacity auctions for securing DER and signaling where investments should go, and energy auctions for the operation of DER. As I mentioned, the November 2020 local capacity auction, it had a modest capacity target of 10 megawatts, and it cleared at 64 cents per kilowatt day, which I don't personally think in those terms for capacity prices. So that translates to $80,000 per megawatt for that 6-month period, May to October. We focus on dispatchable DER in the demonstration because we want to get into the nitty-gritty of operational issues. So specifically, gas-fired demand response and storage were eligible, including aggregations. And the minimum size threshold was 100 kilowatt, and you'll sort of recognize that from FERC Order 2222. And while we're in Canada are of course not subject to FERC, I think the industry is sort of anchored to that number in general now. The DER and the demonstration, they have to be available from noon to 9 p.m. on business days, and the activations are managed through the energy auctions. They can be due to local need, or they could be due to wholesale need. So both of those signals are sent in the demonstration via the distribution system operator. And we've come up with some very basic logic to demonstrate DLMP, distribution locational marginal prices, in the demonstration. It's basic in the sense that it only works with non-wires in a radial system, and it ignores losses. But regardless, I think it's a step towards that more granular distribution pricing. And also it's where the more sophisticated tools that Ben and Elli spoke to would come in the future to generate prices in a more rigorous and granular way. And I should also note, I wanted to note on the slide that the capacity price of 64 cents, it notionally represents both the capacity value both at the distribution and transmission levels. And that has to do with the model that we adopted, that total DSO model, where the DSO is really sending all of the signals, distribution and transmission, and paying for those services, both of those levels of services. And then in concept, the distribution system operator would recover some of those costs as it then interfaces with the ISO and participates in the wholesale market. Just wanted to quickly show you our participants in the demonstrations. We're quite pleased with this. It was a variety of participants, 7 of them. So there's variety both in terms of participants and the DER type. So we had grocery stores, district energy, CNI customers, as well as a residential aggregation. And the DER included CHP, just general load curtailment, smart thermostats, and behind the meter gas generation as well. As my final slide here, with only a few minutes left to get into Q&A, just some thoughts around TE and non-wires and distribution services and prices. So I think that that distribution non-wires is a key value driver for transactive energy. With non-wires, there's also distribution congestion. Again, as my fellow panelists spoke to, there's distribution congestion that needs to be managed. And one way to do that, and to my mind, a good way of doing that is with distribution LNP. I also think that we need to set everything up with machines in mind and not people, so processes that machines can manage without humans in the loop. And programs and auctions lend themselves very well to that. One of the aspects that we at the ISO, again, are very focused on is how transmission distribution coordination can be done in a reliable manner. And finally, my sense is that we need to think further about reliability requirements as it relates to DER and the distribution system. It's probably not going to be as easy as sort of lifting those reliability requirements from the transmission level and then transplanting them at the distribution level. And I just wanted to, as my final bullet here, just do a little bit of a plug. The ISO, we're working on a DER roadmap, and where we will laying out the plan for how to integrate, or how we plan to integrate DER in the wholesale market here in Ontario. So take a look at that on our website, and we actually have a engagement webinar on June 22nd. So please join us for that. And with that, that's everything that I had, and we only have a minute here to do Q&A. So maybe I'll quickly take a look at the questions here, if the panelists can pop back up, and we'll maybe take 1 or 2 questions and wrap up. So one of the questions from the audience is, how is DER advancement in Canada compared to other countries? And maybe it's sort of natural to compare it to the US. Any thoughts on that, folks? Elli, Ben, you guys are very familiar with the progress of DER in the US. Any comments?
I'm not familiar with the Canada progress of DERs, to be honest. So I do.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, if you guys want to speak to the US, I can cover the Canada portion. Elli, did you want to speak to the US?
Sure. PERC 2222 is probably going to change the picture, but it seems like initially there was a lot of incentives for DERs. Now these need to be slowed down, and utilities need to sort of ramp up their pace to match sort of a lot of DERs. Utilities ISOs in the United States are challenged by a lot of DERs. So I think in the United States, we can sort of say that there's this gap right now of trying to slow down the pace of DERs, or actually trying to match the pace of their development with the pace of sort of the utility planning and operations.
Yeah, thanks, Elli. And maybe just to cover off Canada, I mean, it depends on the province in Canada that we're talking about, but certainly here in Ontario, there's quite a bit, more than 4,000 megawatts of DER already deployed, and we expect more to be coming as well, driven by demand charges and programs and non-wires opportunities as they emerge as well. So there's quite a bit going on here in Canada.
Yeah.
Ben?
I guess, I want to add one thing in the US is, in the US, it tends to be very state by state. Different states regulators will put out different RFPs, let's say, for DER generally, and that would be, let's say, for solar. But then you now have like the customer demand portion, and this is, I don't know how similar it is in Canada, but certainly electric vehicle and electric vehicle home chargers, it tends to be the case that people charge their EV at home, and especially overnight, is one of the big DERs that's changing the landscape of load management in the US. As far as PV, you do have states like California that mandate that all new build come with PV. And then you'll get these local laws, like the one that I mentioned earlier, like Local Law 97, that are creating implicit prices for carbon, which are probably going to force the real estate owners of those buildings to essentially look at load management schemes for the buildings, or look at other carbon offsets for their buildings. But the thing that's becoming interesting is a lot of those laws are starting to not look at the indirect offset, like I build a building, I buy a carbon credit. They're really asking the carbon intensity of the building to be reduced somehow. And the last point is community aggregation is a topic in the US. Community aggregation meaning there might be a large warehouse that has a bunch of PV on top, and that warehouse can sell the shares of its output to other members in some nearby area, right? Like it might not be the case that someone on a different, let's say, distribution substation can purchase a solar offset from someone across on a different substation, but certainly like within some local enough area, they'd be able to purchase from each other.
Thank you both. And there's another question here, and maybe I'll turn it to Tanguy, and we'll wrap up after this question, I think. So Tanguy, to get us started, can you speak to why DER would want to participate in wholesale-like markets as opposed to programs such as net metering?
Right, no, that's a great question, and that's something that the industry, especially in the US with the new FERC order, is considering very closely. At a high level, there is a notion that first off, those retail programs might not be there forever. Those retail programs are engineered, and the cost of those programs is shared across all ratepayers. So there is notion that this was maybe a tool to support the penetration of DERs in the initial stages, but those programs might not be there forever, and maybe that in the long term, approaches along the lines of what Elli and Ben have discussed today will be more prevalent. And so that's kind of like one of the motivations to get started on enabling DERs to provide wholesale market services. Still, those programs are here today, the retail programs. And so there is generally a trade-off between that customers are going to be considering between staying on those programs as long as they're available, and maybe if the numbers make sense, consider switching to providing market services, at least part-time, if that's allowed, as long as the financial incentives are there. So I think it's a little bit early to be able to really speak to whether or not there will be an uptake in DR participation through aggregation in the next few months and years, when aggregators start developing their new business models. But certainly that trade-off is.
Oh, seems like we lost Tanguy. So I don't know, Elli, Ben, did you want to add anything to that? That was pretty comprehensive. I don't have anything to add. Did you want to speak to that as well?
No, I think Tanguy hit all the right notes. It's very much the case that net energy metering, has existed for about 3 decades now, and was appropriate in many ways for customer-owned solar that crucially didn't really have a way of managing itself other than maybe some inverters recently. And now as you get like much more configurable and price responsive assets to the distribution system, a lot of these programs will have to change, and the way that people evaluate or determine their value will change as well. So it's not so much that why would the DER want to leave NEM, as much as is it appropriate for NEM to be extended? NEM and FIT, that is to say.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Elli, any final thoughts?
Not really. Great replies from both Tanguy and Ben.
Yes, and recognizing that we're over time. Thank you very much, everyone on the panel. Thank you all the members of the audience, and of course, Rives. And again, thanks very much.
Thank you all. Bye.